Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we keep the old stories alive by retelling them for a new audience so that they will never be forgotten. Last episode, we heard the story of the origins of Beira, the Winter Queen, and the story of the coming of Angus and Bride, the King and Queen of Summer. So, this episode, we're going to look a little deeper at the stories and their meaning, and I'll also tell a few relevant short stories that I just felt we didn't have time for last time. And finally, I'll share a short poem inspired by the stories. So, Beira was often called the Cailleach, or the Great Cailleach, or the First Cailleach. Cailleach is an old Gaelic word which translates as veiled one. The original Cailleach were old female gods, worshipped and feared for centuries in Scotland, long before we were a united nation. Beira herself was served by 8 hags, known as the Lesser Cailleach, but there were many other old female gods and deities who shared the title. The first Cailleach, Beira, is an incredibly important figure in Scots mythology. Last episode, we heard how Beira shaped and formed the mountains and valleys of Scotland in her youth, including the peaks of Ben Wyvis and Little Wyvis, with earth and rock carried in her great creel or wicker basket. There are many other shorter tales of the making of our landscape by Beira, and I'd like to relate a couple of my favourites, which we really didn't have time for last episode. So, without further ado, let's begin another short story of Beira the Winter Queen in her youth. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, Beira, the Winter Queen, ruled the long cold months between summers. Beira was an old goddess, one of the first to set foot on Scotland's shores, long before the idea of Scotland as a nation even existed. It was said that when the world was young, Beira saw land where now there is water, and water where now there is land. It is told by some that once a wizard, walking in the snow-covered hills, chanced upon the Winter Queen while she tended a herd of deer on the slopes of Ben Nevis, which was the peak where she made her home. Her aspect was that of an old woman wearing a large grey shawl covered in a dusting of hoarfrost. The wizard spoke to Beira, asking the Winter Queen, "Tell me your age, O sharp and ancient woman." Beira looked thoughtfully at the hills surrounding her and said in a voice as cold as the wind that blows from the north, "I have long ceased to count the years, but I shall tell you what I have seen. Yonder is a loch. I remember when it was a small, round well. Yonder is a deep river. I remember when no water flowed across that ground. Yonder is the seal-haunted rock of Skerryvore in the midst of the sea. I remember when it was a mountain surrounded by fields. I saw the fields ploughed, and the barley that grew upon them was sharp and juicy. In those days I was a fair young girl, and now I am old and frail, dark and miserable." Beira's misery and sadness is constant, following the curtailing of her powers and the breaking of her dominion over the land by the coming of Angus and Bride, the King and Queen of Summer. After this, she is seen in the winter months solemnly wandering the land, often singing a sorrowful lament, some of which may be recounted in the contents of an old Scots ballad. "O life that ebbs like the sea, I am weary and old, weary and old. Oh, how can I happy be, all alone in the dark and cold? I am the old Beira again, my mantle is no longer green. I think of my beauty with pain, and the days when another was queen. My arms are withered and thin, my hair, once golden, is grey. 'Tis winter, my reign doth begin, youth's summer has faded away. Youth's summer and autumn have fled, I am weary and old, weary and old. Every flower must fade and fall dead, when the wind blows cold, the wind blows cold. During her lamented youth, Beira was responsible for making many of the bens and glens of Scotland. She was powerful and lore-wise, to be sure, but the old gods of most cultures are far from infallible. We saw this with Beira's accidental creation of the hill called Little Wivus, formed when Beira tripped and spilled the earth and rock from her creel, making the small peak. Another of Beira's mishaps formed Loch Awe in Argyll. There was once a well on the slopes of the mountain Ben Cruachan. It was said that each day Beira would draw water from the well, which fed a small burn which twisted down through the glen below the peak. Every morning Beira lifted off a great slab of rock which covered and controlled the flow of water from the spring. Every evening, before sunset, she replaced the slab. It's said that one evening Beira forgot to put the slab back in the evening, and the proper order of things was disturbed. As soon as the sun set, the water from the spring rose in a great torrent, spewing from the earth like a geyser. The water streamed down the mountain side of Ben Cruachan in a mighty wave, roaring like the storm-swollen sea. The next morning, when Beira returned to the well, she found that the valley beneath Ben Cruachan had completely filled with water, and this was how Loch Awe came to be accidentally created. A slightly different tale is told in Inverness about another well and spring, although it was one of Beira's many children who was responsible for tending to this well. Like the spring on Ben Cruachan, this well also had to be covered each evening by a slab of rock, which would control the waters which flowed from it. This time, though, one of Beira's many children had the job of replacing the slab. This child was a daughter of Beira called Nessa. Nessa didn't forget to replace the slab, as Beira had on Ben Cruachan. However, it happened one evening that Nessa was late in coming to the spring. As Nessa approached the well, the sun was already down, and she beheld a vast torrent of water gushing from the spring. Nessa tried to fight her way close enough to the spring to replace the slab of rock, but a great torrent of water came crashing down the hillside towards her, and the young goddess turned and ran away in fear. Beira, her mother, was watching from the top of Ben Nevis, and saw Nessa turn and run in fear from the waters. She was furious with her child, and cursed Nessa for all time, crying out, "Foolish child who runs in fear from water cold and pure and clear, you shall be no longer Beira's daughter, now run forever, never leaving the water." As soon as Beira spoke those words, her daughter was transformed into a river, whose waters would run forever towards a loch and then on to the sea. The river and the loch were both named after Beira's cursed daughter, and that is how Loch Ness and the River Ness gained their names. In the Highlands of Scotland, it is said that once a year, on the same night that she was first transformed, Nessa arises from the waters of the river as a beautiful young girl and can be seen singing a sweet, sad song in the pale moonlight. The stories that surround Beira, including the coming of Angus and Bride, are some of my favourite types of mythological tale. Similar kinds of stories can be found in the early mythologies of most cultures. They were conceived and written by people striving to understand the world around them and why it is the way it is. The people of early Iron Age Scotland, unsurprisingly, didn't know that U-shaped valleys and mountains were formed by glaciation. And so we get these fabulous tales about how gods created the landscape. Mountains made by piling up earth and rocks, and rivers and lochs made by the misadventures of mythical figures. Even the boulders, which litter Scotland's hillsides, have their story. Beira's giant children, known as the Four Giants, were said to fight constantly, and at night they would climb their mountain homes and hurl the huge boulders at one another. In terms of Beira's story, I really like the characterization that often comes across in these early mythological tales. We see the same thing in Old Norse and Greek stories. The antagonists, like Beira, are more than just one-dimensional characters with abstract evil goals. Beira was so much more than just a wicked queen archetype who kidnapped a princess because that's what wicked queens do. She was an understandable character with relatable reasons for the things she did. She was trying to hold on to her youth and not lose control over the land which she had worked hard in helping to fashion. It's not hard to feel sorry for Beira as she tries and fails to hold back the turning of time and the changing of her world. Which brings us nicely to our second story from the last episode, the coming of Angus and Bride, and of Beira's defeat. Now, the usurping of a parent by a child is another type of story that we see repeatedly in mythology all over the world. Greek myth tells us how Kronos overthrew his father Uranus and was eventually himself defeated by his son Zeus. However, the tale of Angus and Bride is much more than a simple tale of good over evil and light over dark. Again, the story lets people understand something about their world. In this case, it's the turning of the seasons. Personifying natural processes is another theme we see repeated across numerous mythos. In Scotland, we have the coming of spring and summer explained by the coming of Angus and Bride. In the Greek mythos, the changing of the seasons was explained by the abduction of the goddess Persephone by Hades. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of harvest and new growth. Demeter was so grieved by her daughter's abduction that until Persephone was returned from the underworld, nothing would grow in the world. Since Persephone had to return to Hades for 6 months of every year, these were the autumn and winter months when nothing would grow. Both of these stories, though, and others like them, do more than just explain the natural processes of the world. They gave men and women the chance to influence and change those processes, or at least the appearance of it. If the seasons change due to random and abstract changes in meteorological conditions, then there is little, if anything, that anybody can do to, for example, ensure a good harvest. If, on the other hand, the changing of the seasons is controlled by an anthropomorphic personification of the process, then that god or deity can be prayed to or given offerings to ensure a good harvest. And this is when stories and mythology begin to cross the fine line into proto-religions. In the story of Angus and Bride, Angus is also a well-rounded character. He's not just an infallible hero, he is rash and impatient, as many young people are. Angus ignores the advice of the fairy king of the Green Isle, who warns him to wait to challenge his mother and rescue Bride until the proper time. Instead, Angus acts prematurely, and this makes his task in the long run far harder than it would have been had he waited. There are a lot of lovely themes and layers and threads to the story of the coming of Angus and Bride. Some are obvious, and some are more subtle. The story is clearly a tale of the triumph of a child over a parent, and of light and good over dark and evil. Because Beira's actions, although relatable and understandable, are clearly wrong. You can't just go around kidnapping princesses. We can also clearly see the importance of perseverance, which is a theme repeated in many Scots and other folk tales. Angus didn't just immediately succeed in his efforts to defeat his mother. He had to try again and again, being pushed back and having to return repeatedly before finally being successful. It's also a story of the futility of resisting the turning of time and the coming of change, and the natural order of the world. Beira was driven, as many parental characters in this kind of story are, by the pointless attempt to hold on to her youth and power in the face of a changing world. She tried in vain to forestall the changes and alter the natural order of the world by plunging the land into an eternal winter over which she could reign for all time. Another less obvious meaning in the story, at least for me, is the importance of men and women to each other. The princess bride, who is rescued by Angus from his mother Beira's clutches, is often overlooked as a less important part of the story. But again, for me at least, Bride is just as important as Angus to the defeat of Beira. When Angus is repeatedly beaten back by Beira and her 8 lesser Cailleach, it's Bride who comes to him when he grows tired and weary with food and water from the Green Isle. Without the help and support of his wife Bride, Angus would very likely have lost the fight with the Winter Queen. Beira, in contrast, is always seen acting essentially alone. She has her 8 hag servants, it's true, but they obey her commands rather than giving her any sort of independent support or assistance. We even see Beira's one-time husband and partner, Bodach, in the story, actively acting against Beira. Angus, who has the love and support of his partner Bride, eventually triumphs over Beira, who has lost the love and support of her partner Bodach. The stories of Beira, the Winter Queen, and of Angus and Bride, the King and Queen of Summer, are some of my favourite ancient Scots folk tales. Before we finish up this follow-up episode, I'd like to share a short poem inspired by these stories with you all. So, I hope you enjoy it. When from the north a chill wind blows, when mountains are encased with snow, when every single leaf is shed and trees stand barren, looking dead, like soldiers marching through the mist, retreating to a place that doesn't exist. When all the land seems petrified and brave men fear to go outside, when clouds obscure the mountain tops and even rivers freeze and stop, when snow lies thick as desert sand, the Queen of Winter walks the land. When mountain hares wear snow-white coats, along with ptarmigans and stoats, when birds prepare for harder times, or just migrate to warmer climes, when creatures shelter from the cold, underground in hidden holes, when ice sheets span the widest river, when spring and summer seem lost forever, when dark clouds seethe with wind and violence, when forests echo with icy silence, with storm and hail at her command, the Queen of Winter walks the land. When icicles hang like stalactites, she walks the world she dusted white. Behind she leaves a glistening haze, she freezes lochs with just her gaze. Her features are gaunt, hard and precise, her breath is cold and sharp as ice. Her cold eyes sparkle like frozen dew, her skin is tinged with darkest blue. Her hair is the grey of stormy cloud, around her shoulders she wears a tattered shroud. With ice and frost in both her hands, the Queen of Winter walks the land. When sunlight bathes the world in gold, driving out the ice and cold, melting frost and deepest snow, allowing buds to sprout and grow. When flowers all begin to bloom and fill the air with sweet perfume, when new grass starts to grow again, when life flows up through root and stem, when hills are green from top to bottom, when trees are heavy with fruits and blossom, the King and Queen of Summer crowned, Angus and Bride tread the ground. When the bird of bride begins to sing to mark the coming of the spring, when blackbirds all begin to haver and bees begin their busy labour, when moors are bright with purple heather blooming in the clement weather, when fields are gold with crops of corn, when sheeps have winter fleeces shorn, when dewdrops shine like precious pearls, when endless blue skies unfurl, when violets blossom all around, Angus and bride tread the ground. The king of summer, the ever young, who brings with him the warming sun, and always with him by his side his queen, the fair young maiden, bride, with silver dewdrops on her dress and the guiding star upon her breast. When trees become a verdant green, when frozen burns run pure and clean, when eagles' nests on cliffs and crags, when forests echo with rutting stags, when life can thrive free and unbound, Angus and bride tread the ground. So, that's the end of this episode of Never Lost. Thank you for joining me, and I very much hope to see you next story.